Whether you've just started teaching or spent decades in the classroom, you know there's always more to learn. But where do you start? Well, here at Hillsdale College, we have the answer for you. Tried and True, a primer on sound pedagogy by Hillsdale College professor Daniel Copeland. In this little book, you'll read lessons from more than 25 years of Dr. Copeland's classroom experience. It's all distilled into 14 easy-to-read chapters on lesson planning, assignments, and classroom management, and it will help you improve your skills and inspire you as a teacher, one of our most important professions. Whether you've been in front of the classroom for years, or this is your first year, when you read Tried and True, you'll find something to help you keep improving every single day. You don't need to go at it alone. Let Dr. Copeland's real-world experience encourage you and inspire you. You can get your copy today at hillsdale.edu/true. That's hillsdale.edu/TRUE. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We continue our series of episodes from presentations delivered at the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence Seminar on the Art of Teaching Mathematics. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence is an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offering seminars in classical academics and pedagogy for teachers nationwide of any background. Seminars are led by the faculty, leadership, and master teachers of Hillsdale College. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. To learn more and to register, visit the webpage for the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence at k12.hillsdale.edu. Click the Events tab and look for Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. In November 2023, Dr. Jonathan Gregg, Assistant Professor of Education, spoke to a gathering of teachers and school leaders in a lecture titled Asking Great Questions in Math.
Okay, welcome. It's good to see you all. I'm impressed with you in that I think if I were given the choice between staying in my seat and walking across the hall, I'd probably stay in my seat. So thank you for walking across the hall. It's impressive. If you were here last night, you notice that I have a tie on today because last night was philosophy and fun. Today it's pedagogy, business. It's business time. I've titled this talk "Teaching Wonderfully Through Socratic Questioning." I'm hoping this will be certainly. I'm hoping it to be applicable to you. I am going to start it off with a little bit of theory, but we're going to get into practice pretty quickly. Let me begin with this lovely quote from Josef Pieper, who some of you may know as the author of Leisure, the Basis of Culture. But this is actually from an essay called The Philosophical Act. It may seem strange to start a math talk by talking about philosophy, but I think Pieper's pretty insightful in this moment. He says, really the situation is this. The deeper aspects of reality are apprehended in the ordinary things of everyday life, and not in a sphere cut off from and segregated from it, the sphere of the essential, or whatever it may be called. It is in the things we come across in the experience of everyday life that the unusual emerges, and we no longer take them for granted. And that situation corresponds with the inner experience which has always been regarded as the beginning of philosophy, the act of marveling. Okay? So what I think Pieper's after here is actually some kind of pedagogy. And by pedagogy, I don't mean anything fancy, right? In Greek, pedagogy means child leader, right? A leader of children. And pedagogy, he's saying, Pieper's goal here, he wants his students to be able to philosophize. He wants them to know what philosophy is like. But he knows that he can't just say, philosophize, in the same way that I can't just say, learn math to my students. that I actually need some sort of vehicle to pull this off. I need to answer the question of how, and that's the pedagogical question. How, as teachers, do we do this thing? Okay, so Pieper wants his students to be philosophical, and he's looking for how, and he says, I don't need something essential. I don't need something very fancy for this act, right? He says the deeper aspects of reality, which is in some ways what we want them to know, mathematics, getting at this idea, are not in something essential, but they're in the everyday experiences. That's when the unusual emerges and students wonder. Where I think what Pieper's getting at here is he's saying is that he's not just looking for a part of pedagogy, he's looking for the key to pedagogy. He's looking for the root of pedagogy. He's looking for the thing, the sine qua non of pedagogy, the without which nothing is possible, and with which everything is possible. He's looking for the key, the pedagogical key. And here's what he arrives at the end. He arrives at marveling. Okay? He picks this up in just a second, continuing this by actually going and quoting Plato in a Socratic dialogue called the Theaetetus. There's actually a quote from the student Theaetetus to his teacher Socrates. It says, by all the gods, Socrates, I really cannot stop marveling at the significance of these things, and at moments I grow positively giddy when I look at them. As the young mathematician Theaetetus impulsively declares, after Socrates has brought him to the point of admitting his ignorance with his shrewd and kindly but staggering and astonishing questions that stagger and astonish with wonder. And then follows Socrates' ironical answer, yes, that is the very frame of the mind that constitutes the philosopher. That and nothing else is the beginning of philosophy. There, for the first time in the Theaetetus, without solemnity or ceremony, almost by the way, though fresh as dawn, appears the thought that has become commonplace in the history of pedagogy. The beginning of philosophy is wonder. Okay? So I think what we have here is Pieper and really Socrates saying, if you want your students to be able to think deeply about something, the very first thing you have to do is get them to wonder. Okay? But I also can't just stand up here and say to you guys, get your students to wonder, because that's not going to work. That's not easy, okay? Where you have to have, as a teacher, some actual, tangible ways to get students to wonder, okay? And that's what I'm hoping to do for you today, is to get you just to think about the hows of pedagogy, the hows of the how, right? How do you guys, as teachers, do the pedagogical work to get your students to wonder, okay? And the very first thing I want to talk about for just a second is what is wonder, because I think this is key, right? Pieper continues here. He's talking about what wonder actually is. He says, wonder does not make a man able. It means, after all, to be profoundly moved and shaken. And those who undertake to live under the sign and constellation wonder must certainly be prepared to find themselves lost at times in the ordinary workaday world. Wonder acts upon man like a shock. He is moved and shaken, and in the dislocation that succeeds, all that he has taken for granted as being natural or self-evident loses its compact solidity and obviousness. He is literally dislocated, and he no longer knows where he is. Okay? So what we have here is actually a beautiful equivocation on the word wonder. Pieper's talking about wonder in two different ways here, and I think we use this naturally when we think about wonder. We use wonder both as this idea of to marvel, to stand in awe of, to be moved by, to be, I don't know if you saw the sunset this morning, or sunrise this morning, right? I wondered at that sunrise. I wondered at that sunrise in some sense, okay? There was a marveling that took place. And we want that for our students. But he's saying that's not the only way we use wonder, right? We use wonder in a second capacity. We use wonder in a way that says, I don't know something. I wonder about that. I wonder if my flight's going to be on time. I wonder if I'm going to lose my voice sometime through this talk because I've been talking very loudly. I wonder in this idea of being shaken. Sometimes in the education literature, you hear something like cognitive dissonance, right? That's the kind of thing that we're interested in. Something is confusing to us. We want to know more about it. I wonder about that thing. I wonder if the Vikings are going to beat the Falcons this Sunday. This is the kind of thing that we actually think about when we're thinking about wonder, is that it requires an unknowing. It requires you to be dislocated. And actually those two things, the two definitions of wonder go hand in hand. In that I wonder about something, then I learn it, and then I marvel at it, right? Learning is the thing that happens in the middle, right? That learning, there has to be some desire that takes place. We never learn unless we have some desire to do so. Right? 2 months ago, I learned how to put Freon in my car. Right? Why did I learn that? Because it was 100 degrees and the air conditioning went out, and therefore I had the desire to put Freon in my car. Right? The desire breeds the learning. Right? And so there has to be some initial desire. And desire happens because we feel the lack of something. Why do we want things? Because we don't have them. And so to get a student to feel the lack of something, right, that's the kind of wonder that happens at the beginning. Then learning takes place in some capacity, and then you're actually able to wonder about it on the other side. You're actually able to marvel at it. This is what Pieper is talking about. And actually this idea of shock, and the quote from the Theaetetus is going to lead me back to, and I promise I'm going to get out of philosophy here in just a second, but I want to go back to the Theaetetus for a second, because actually we see in Socrates some way of modeling how this takes place. Okay? Socrates actually calls himself a torpedo fish at times, which is an electric ray, because his goal is to shock his students, right? This idea of wonder being a shock in some sense, right? That we are sort of moved or shaken, dislocated in a certain sense. Okay, so let's go to the Theaetetus for a second. Socrates actually describes himself in the other image that I want to think about. He describes himself as a midwife, right? Teaching as midwifery in some sense. Right? He says, my art of midwifery is in some respects like theirs, but differs in that I attend men and not women, and I look after their souls when they are in labor, and not after their bodies. And the triumph of my art is in thoroughly examining whether the thought which the mind of the young man brings forth is a false idol or a noble and true birth. Okay? So we're getting another piece to this pedagogical shape, where shock happens, student response happens, and Socrates is saying we have to actually test whether that response is a good idea. There's a testing that's taking place. That is a piece of learning here. Socrates keeps going here. He says, come then to me, who am a midwife's son, and myself a midwife, and do your best to answer the questions which I will ask you. And if I abstract and expose your firstborn, because I discover upon inspection that the conception which you have formed is a vain shadow, do not quarrel with me on that account, for it would be wrong for me to admit falsehood or to stifle the truth. So we have another piece to this pedagogical vision. Is that one of the ways in which we move or learn is this idea of asking good questions. Socrates is saying, come to me, expose your firstborn, expose your ideas to me, let me question them, and see if they are good or if they are not. And this is the idea that Socrates is saying, this is in some ways how teaching is taking place. Okay, so we have a lot of random ideas here. We have wonder, we have Socratic questioning, we have some way in which students start to make progress in this learning environment. So I want to stitch these all together and say, because again, right, I can't just say, ask questions, and I can't just say, instill wonder. I have to actually give you some framework for this. And I think if we piece together what we see from the Theaetetus and what we see from Pieper, we get something like this. And this is what I contend is a pedagogical shape. Okay, this is how learning takes place. I don't care what kind of school you teach. I don't care what grade level you teach. This is how learning takes place. I do this in first grade when I teach first grade. I do this in 12th grade when I teach 12th grade. I do this in college when I teach college. I do this myself when I learn. This is how learning takes place. Okay, and since this picture is unintelligible to you, let me give some labels to what's going on here. So, I think this begins in some sense with an opening question where I am getting students to wonder off the bat, and that takes place via not just a question, or not just an answer, but it takes place with a question. that the first words out of my mouth when I want to do a class are to pose some sort of question, to ask students to do something. We look at a Platonic dialogue, we look at Socrates, he's doing this type of questioning, and that's the goal here is via an opening question to get some kind of student responses. Okay, these are those blue arrows that are up there. I'm envisioning myself as, I literally picture myself as Thor here, right, with a lightning bolt, and I'm jumping into the middle of my classroom and I'm going, pow, opening question. And the idea there is you spark different student responses. Okay, student ideas. So we have student responses, yes, blue arrows, okay? Then what happens is I'm asking some kind of follow-up questions that are selecting some of the student responses and pointing them down towards what is in this green arrow, which is this idea of truth, or a learning goal, or something that I want my students to walk away with, okay? Then I'm interested in doing some examples, some practice, some applications of that truth, okay? What this looks like is I have something I want my students to walk away with, but this does not happen right at the beginning where I'm handing them the truth. First, I'm trying to instill some kind of wonder, some kind of forcing them to have some ideas. If you were here last night, this is what we start to mean when we talk about humane pedagogy. This engages the humanity of the students. It's student-centered in a way that they are doing the thinking and learning. And what I'm doing as a teacher is I'm teaching Socratically, I'm teaching primarily via questions. Okay, I'm asking them to do certain things, right? And they are the ones that are giving me some responses. And through this discussion, we're arriving at something that I want them to learn, that I want to know, okay? And then from that knowing, we might practice it, we might do some examples, we might further flesh it out, we might do some different things with it, but the goal is that I'm not handing it to them in a certain sense. And this is just what we mean by humane, good teaching. Here's another reason, let me model this for you in just a second, but here's one of the reasons why I know this is good teaching. Is because when you look at the different pedagogical philosophies that are out there right now, what people recommend, there's usually two different ones that you get. You get what I can call a progressive pedagogy, or you can get what I've been calling a hyperclassical pedagogy, okay, or a dogmatic pedagogy, okay? And I think progressive pedagogy gets this top half pretty good. They pose tasks and projects and experiences for students. But it's all about student empowerment, where students can think whatever they want. We want you to be able to follow your own path here, but there's not really any adherence to the truth, okay? Or there's kind of a more dogmatic pedagogy, which is like, here's the truth, let me deal with it, and let's practice it over and over again until you understand it, okay? This, I think, is predominantly what we see in our math classes, actually, regardless of what kind of school you teach at, is we just hand students the truth, and then we expect them to practice it until they get it, okay? Where we're not actually, which I think is good, right? It's a part of a good pedagogical shape, but it's only the second half, okay? We're trying to teach like this, I think, is the humane kind of pedagogy that we're interested in, where it's not just about giving students tasks and letting them explore, and it's not just about giving them truths right off the bat, okay? So, it's easy for me to draw this shape, but let's actually do an example to see what I mean. Let me take first grade math. Let me take multiplication. If I can teach first grade math this way, we can teach a lot of things this way. So, how do we normally teach multiplication? How do we normally do it? Here's how we normally do it. All right, kids, today I have something exciting for you. I'm going to teach you something new. It's called multiplication. Can you guys say that with me? Multiplication. All right, multiplication is super exciting. It's something different than we've done before. It's different than addition. It's different than subtraction. This is multiplication. And multiplication is repeated addition. You guys say that? Repeated addition. And so if I have a repeated addition, something like 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3, now I have to do that. Why would I want to add 3 over and over and over again? This is actually going to make your lives a little bit better, where I can write this as actually a multiplication sentence. So, right, and for multiplication, the things we need to know is how many groups of something we have. So how many 3s do I have up here? 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3. How many 3s? I have 4 3s. That's exactly right. And so what I could write this as 4 x, and x is going to be our symbol for multiplication, 3. And what this means, we would say this as 4 times 3. Say that with me. 4 times 3. And 4 times 3 means 4 groups of 3. Okay? And so if I'm looking for my answer for 4 groups of 3, can we think through this? Can we all count by threes with me? That's right. And 4 times 3 equals 12. Do you guys understand what I mean when I'm saying multiplication? Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so I'll cut. That's how we normally teach multiplication, and there's something really good about this, right? There's truth, but I think we're missing out on this, right? What I've done is I've started with the truth. I've started with what multiplication is. Students have no desire for it, right? And no understanding of why we might care about it, right? And if you have first graders, I've got a first grader right now, they're genuinely amenable and they'll kind of do whatever, they won't do whatever you want, but they're generally good-willed. My first graders. But usually they're willing to do what you want, right? But what happens is if we keep teaching this way, at some point a kid's going to be like, you say I got to flip the number and then multiply to get the answer? Like, why? Or, why do I even care about this thing you're calling a logarithm? Like, what? So we have these types of questions that emerge in students' minds, and either they ask them, and we have no answers, or they don't ask them, and they start to just say, well, I'm not going to like math anymore. I'm going to like something else that's more humane, right? Because we haven't shown the humanity of mathematics. We haven't shown this in our pedagogy. Okay, so let me try first grade multiplication again. All right, guys, I got a question for you guys today. Which of these two things is easier? To figure out how many fingers we have as a whole class, or to figure out how many pets we have as a whole class? You guys are pretty good first graders, right? First graders are both opinionated and thoughtless, right? So fingers, pets, good. Why fingers? Why pets? We can make a case for both of them, yes? We can make a case for both of them, right? Fingers, right? Pets, let's do it. All right, let's figure out how many pets we have as a class. You, how many pets do you have? You, how many pets do you have? How many pets?
2, 3.
Do my children count? Right. Does my goldfish count? This is does my toy right? This is the fun part about teaching. You get student responses, right? Okay, so we've got all the pets on the board. How do we figure out how many pets we have as a whole class? Why do we have to add? Because we're looking for the total. I'm reviewing here, right? I'm reviewing addition. And we'll do it. We'll add it up. We'll figure this out. Okay, now let's do the fingers one. How many fingers do you have? How many fingers do you have? How many fingers do you have? I've got 8. 2 of them are thumbs, right? First graders, right? Yeah, right. You know, right? This is what they're going to do. Right, but again, this is what you want as the class. You want there to be some humanity to your math classroom, okay? And then I stop and I say, do I need to keep asking how many fingers we have to everybody? Do I need to do this? No. Why not? Because everyone has 10 fingers, right? What do I need to know? Notice how many statements I've said so far. 0. Only questions. How many fingers do we have? What do we need to know? I need to know 2 things, right? How many people we have in the class, and then the average number of fingers. Hopefully for multiplication, the number of fingers that one person has, right? And so what I've done, and then I might tell them about multiplication, but what I've done is they've been the ones to say the 2 things we need for this problem are groups and number in each group. They said that, right? And so then I can ask, what kinds of things are like the fingers problem in our world? Toes, right? Noses, ears. What kinds of things that are non-body parts? Wheels on cars. And what they're starting to see is that the reason why we have multiplication, they're not going to be able to ever articulate this, but they're going to be saying, the reason why we have multiplication is because it's a response to our world, that there are multiplication-y things in the world, right? Where I can look at this and say, 6 chairs for each table, 3 rows, that's a multiplication-y situation. It's like the fingers problem. And now, whenever you say, you have this touchstone that when you're teaching, you say, is this like a fingers one or is this like a pets one? You do this via this, right? That I get to the same truth, but I'm interested in beginning with wonder, where I'm saying, fingers or pets, boom, lightning bolt. They're like, oh, wow, never had that question before. It's a new thing. I've never had to do this, right? It's wonder-inducing in some sense. It's not like, oh, wow, marvel at what Dr. Gregg does. But they're like, oh, this is interesting. I should have some ideas. We're working together on this. And this is what you might call a pedagogy that is interested in wonder, okay? That uses wonder to pull this off. And I think this is the way that we actually learn, okay? This isn't about some sort of fancy pedagogical method. This is about learning. This is about how students come to discover and encounter things, okay? Because they need to care about it. They need to have some question that's going to plunge them into the thing itself, okay? If I'm teaching logarithms at 8th grade, okay, anyone teach logarithms in here? Okay, good, right? Logarithms are one of the hardest things in the world to teach. Why? Students don't care. And the definition of them is pretty obscure, right? And so if we begin with the definition, right, they have no desire for it. If you walk in and you're like, let me teach you what a logarithm is today, kids, no one is going to care. Or they might care to pass the test at the end of the class. That might be one reason they care, right? But other than that, they're not going to care. But if I walk in and I put on the board the problem 2 to the x equals 13 and I say go, right? Oh no, 2 to the x equals, right, now you got to get in 8th grade mode. 8th grade mode. Mr. Gregg, that's too hard. Mr. Gregg, why do you do this to us? We don't know. We don't know this one. Oh, well, what if I did 2 plus x equals 13? You guys know that one? 2 plus x? That's 11, Mr. Gregg. How'd you do it? We just subtracted 2 from both sides. And I was like, why'd you subtract 2? Again, notice, questions. All I'm doing is questions, right? Why'd you subtract 2? Well, there was an addition, and we needed to not do this, right? Okay, 2 times x equals 13. Mr. Gregg. 6.5, Mr. Gregg. How'd you know how to do that one? Oh, inverse. What do you know about 2 to the x equals 13? Is it bigger than 10? No, it's less than 10. Is it bigger than, what if it was 2 to the x equals 8? Do you know that answer? What if it was, right, and eventually what I'm going to do is they'll be like, okay, someone's going to be like, it'd be really great if we just had something that undoes exponentiation. Oh, you want a logarithm? Sure, you may. It would be really great if we had something that undoes exponentiation. That would be really lovely. Let me actually teach you about a logarithm. It's the same kind of thing, right? Where they're getting here, they're not going to be able to take every single step, but via me posing some sort of question to them, they actually can have the desire, and that they start to understand math class is not where we walk in and write down whatever the teacher puts on the board, and then we have to do it, and then we have to redo it on the test, and it's going to be confusing, and we're not going to care about it. That's what we normally think about math class. Or math class is where the teacher walks in and asks us to think right away. We figure some stuff out, and then we get somewhere that's actually worth knowing. And is this going to be magic to make everyone love math? It's not, but it at least is going to give you half a shot at having a conversation that's interesting to a student, where it's drawing on their thinking, right? And that they know that math class is somewhere where they're expected to think, they're expected to reason, they're expected to respond. Okay, so the keys to this pedagogy, this guy, yes, and this guy, opening questions and follow-up questions, okay? So I want to talk to you about how to do both those things, because again, I can't just be like, ask good opening questions. That's not helpful for you guys, right? But I have gone through all my lesson plans, and I figured out what kinds of things that I ask, and I've just grouped them into different categories. These are the different kinds of things that I ask for opening questions, and then I've gone through some follow-up questions. I think follow-up questions are a little bit easier to pull off, but what I'm hoping to do, you guys, is to get some way to, if you're interested in teaching Socratically, these are the kind of things that you have to do. You have to commit yourself to asking questions. These are the kinds of questions that I ask. So, opening questions. Let me jump into Peeper for one last thought here. The innermost meaning of wonder is fulfilled in a deepened sense of mystery. It does not end in doubt, but is the awakening of the knowledge that being qua being is mysterious and inconceivable. And that is a mystery in a full sense of the word, neither a dead end, nor a contradiction, nor even something impenetrable and dark. Rather, mystery means that a reality cannot be comprehended because its light is ever-flowing and inexhaustible. That's what the wanderer really experiences. So the opening question has to plunge students into mystery in some sense. So if you're thinking about an opening question, it has to be these 4 things. Number 1, it has to be accessible to all your students. Okay? That when I ask something, students, every single person in the class has to be able to think about it. I'm not asking something that's so high level that I'm losing the bottom third of my class right off the bat. If the first word out of your mouth is something that they can't grasp, you're going to lose them. Okay? There's 2 ways to make it accessible to all students. Either make it so open-ended that everyone can deal with it, or make it in some ways self-differentiating, where you can answer that question on a low level, but you can also answer it at a high level, and both those answers are equally important and valid. Okay? Has to be accessible to all your students. Number 2, it has to be challenging to all your students. Okay? So something like 2 plus 3, if that's my opening question, you're going to lose, again, half your class, because they're going to be like, I already know this. I don't need to be here. Some of you guys were that student, and as soon as you guys started doodling on your boards as soon as something got said by the teacher, because you're like, I got this already. I don't have to be here. I don't care. So it has to be something that no one should be able to completely figure out right off the bat. Okay? It's got to be, so the fingers and pets one, everyone can have a thought about that, but no one has has written the tome on figuring out this fingers pets problem, and so it's interesting in some ways to everybody. Number 3, it has to provoke multiple thoughtful student responses, where there's not one correct answer that I'm looking for right off the bat, but I'm looking for a lot of different ways in which students might interact with that thing. Okay? I want there to be a lightning bolt that gives me multiple student responses. So I'm not interested in a singular answer. This is tough in a math class, but I'm interested in some sort of discovery where even the fingers and pets one, can you make a case for pets being easier? Can you make a case for fingers being easier? You can. Both of those are legitimate responses. And at the end, I'm not really interested in the easiness of this, right? I'm just interested in them being different problems. Okay? Lastly, it does have to be in some ways directly oriented towards the truth or the learning goal of that day, right? Where I'm interested in something being oriented towards that truth. I'm not just asking, go find some triangles, kids, right? That's not directly aimed at the truth. That's just an experience, okay? This has to be a directed question. So, and I think in particular, the top 2 together and the bottom 2 together are pretty difficult needles to thread, in that you want something that's both accessible to everyone and challenging to everyone. That's tough, okay? You want something that's going to provoke multiple right answers or right responses and be directly oriented towards the truth. This is tough. Opening questions, I think, are the hardest task that we are given as teachers, is to come up with something off the bat that's going to provoke interest in my students, but also be direct and able to get everyone together on something, but also be oriented towards the truth. This is the hardest thing. If you're looking to a curriculum for this, there's not a lot of curricula that do this really well, okay? This is one of the things that teachers often have to do themselves, especially in mathematics where we don't write textbooks this way. A lot of times, even when you have a math textbook, the first thing that you see on the page is the formula, right? And so we teach it that way. We're like, open your books, kids, to page 24, and let's read the formula here, right? Because the textbooks are teaching us to teach this way, but this is not how we teach, right? This is the work of teaching where you got to think about some opening questions. I get opening questions wrong a good chunk. You're going to have to if you're going to teach this way, it's failure, right? A good chunk of the time. You're going to walk out of class and be like, I tried to ask a good question. It fell flat. The students weren't interested in it. I'm going to try again tomorrow, right? Sometimes I say to teachers, if you're not banging your head against the wall 40% of the time, you're doing the job wrong. Right? If you're banging it against your wall 100% of the time, that's not good. But if you bang your head against the wall no percent of the time, you're also not doing it right. Right? Teaching should be at least a little bit of an exercise in futility. Okay, good. So, what are the kinds of things that do this? I've got 5 for you. These are 5 things that I ask my students to do. Number 1, this is the most basic one, but I ask my students to notice. Okay? I give them some phenomena. I show them something. Especially if you're teaching science, this is great, right? Notice something that's going on. A question of why. Okay? Some examples here, right? Or the idea here is to try to see some sort of meaning or relationship or pattern around us and try to explain it, right? Why does, especially useful, I think, for generating formulas, but it's this why questions, right? Why can we not use our method for adding 23 plus 45 for the question 23 plus 48? Why is being a hero so difficult? Why do feathers fall slower than bowling balls? Notice something that's going on here. Right? I'm asking my students to make a notice, right? And notice, I mean, even if it's this thing, right? Just the difference between saying, okay, yesterday we did addition without regrouping. Today we're going to do addition with regrouping. Right? Here's what I mean when we're doing addition with regrouping. Right? Just flip it and ask them to say this, right? Ask them to notice stuff about it. What's going on here? And for them to be like, I've got too many ones, Mr. Gregg. That's worth its weight in gold pedagogically for them to be able to say that thing. Oh, well, what do you do with those too many ones? Should the answer be 60-11? Maybe it's 60-11. What would be, this is my 4-year-old to be like, 60-11. Right? But it's Socratic in that it's forcing them to make the observation. It's forcing them to have the desire to be like, oh, this is a different problem. I can't use my method previously. It's not world-breaking, an opening question, but it's getting them to do the kind of intellect. Right? What we want is for our students to do the intellectual heavy lifting. We get to ask them the questions to let them do that, but students do into the intellectual heavy lifting. Okay? They're the ones that are saying, there's too many ones. I need something else. Oh, well, what could we do? You get to ask the questions. Okay. Number 2, I ask my students to notice. I ask them to compare. Right? I just did an example of this. Fingers versus pets. Make a comparison. Make a contrast. Right? What's the difference between? It's a juxtaposition of two related ideas. It's often just trying to get them to say best, worst, easiest, hardest. This is a really good one in that students are very interested in things being easy, and things being best, and things being worst, and things being hardest, right? This is one of my favorite ones because it just says, hey, look at these two things. Which one do you like better? That works pretty well, right? What's the difference between a moment when you need to be decisive and a moment when you need to be cautious? What's the difference between the way Elizabeth envisions marriage and the way that Darcy envisions marriage? Again, I'm using examples that are not just math here because I think you teach this way regardless. It's the same pedagogical shape. I don't care whether you teach in 12th grade. I'm doing fundamental theorem of calculus like this. Okay? What's the difference between 24 minus 13 and 24 minus 15? Just asking them to notice something that's going on. Just asking them to compare two different things. Talk to me about these two things together. Okay? I ask my students to notice. I ask them to compare. Number 3, I ask them to create. How would you? Questions or design questions. I ask them to make something, especially if you're teaching lower school math. Drawing pictures is one of the key things that we do with students. I ask them to draw. I ask them to or respond to their own picture. Okay? But I do this in 11th grade as well. I think I have an example here from 11th grade. Yeah, if I'm teaching something like expected value, design me a game that seems fair but isn't. Go. Right? They're going to come up with all sorts of creative stuff. Right? Get them using their creativity. Design something. Create something. Draw something. And what you have, again, go through your four things. Right? Is this accessible to everyone? Yeah, everyone can use creativity. Everyone can design. Is it challenging to everyone? Yeah, right? Are you going to get multiple student responses? Absolutely, right? And especially if you got them working on a little whiteboard, I can walk around and be like, give me your whiteboard, give me your whiteboard. Look at these two. What's going on here? What's going on here? Again, I'm just asking the questions. This is what design a scenario that the Roman system of government might particularly struggle to handle. Come up with something. But it requires them to know something to be able to come up with it. Yeah, sure. A little longer. Yeah, I would say that's 11th grade. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily do that that's maybe more like an 11th grade thing I used that one when I was teaching expected value, so a little more of a upper level one. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily use that at the second, third, fourth grade level. But I could certainly use, sorry, these are, I'm trying to get questions that span the gamut. But I might ask the design a scenario that the Roman system of government I might use that at a fourth grade level-ish if I've spent some time. What would be something that the Romans wouldn't do well with? Create something. Sure, maybe. Might be in 8th grade. Might be more of a 7th, 8th grade type question. Maybe I wouldn't do that for 3rd. Maybe I'd do something else. So, again, opening questions are hard. Opening question, this is the hard thing, right? To get it, to pitch it, right? But the act of trying to figure stuff out, you're gonna walk out and be like, whew, that question was too hard for my kids. Or, yeah, that was too easy. My kids weren't interested in that one. Right? Gonna happen. No getting around it. Number 4, I ask them to notice, to compare, to create. I ask them to struggle in some sense. Right? How could? Right? And I do this in 2 ways. I ask them that something that initially seems impossible to them, I want them to feel the impossibility of it. This is, one of the examples here, 2 to the x equals 13. I want them to struggle with that. A lot of times I'll break them into groups and let them struggle with each other just so that they're forced to talk about it. Right? But I plunge them in. I say, how do you win a war? Now, is this accessible to everyone? No. But the fact that it's accessible to none of them kind of makes it accessible to all of them in a sense. Right? Where no one's going to know how to solve 2 to the x equals 13 if I haven't taught them about logarithms, but everyone's in the same boat in not knowing, and so the goal here is not to solve it, but to have a thought. Okay? And so in sometimes pitching a question so far up here, right, that no one's there, it has an accessibility of its own here. Especially if I break them into groups and I make them talk about this with each other in some sense. Right? Have an idea. Have a thought. And the best way to follow up with struggle, we'll get this in follow-up questions, right? The best follow-up question is, what's hard about this? Right? Where I'm acknowledging this is hard, and I'm getting them to say, what's difficult about this? And guess which kid is going to be the best at answering that question? Your lowest kid, right? Your lowest kid is going to know that one because they know stuff is hard. And so when you ask them, what's hard about this? Like, oh yeah, I know what's hard. It's this. That's hard. Right? And you're like, yes, it is. Right? So it's the kind of thing that there is an accessibility to a question like this. So we either pull something impossible that then we're trying to clarify, right? Or we pull something simple that as soon as we start, right? So I think that's this, how do you win a war? Well, you win a war by having bigger guns. Well, maybe, right? Something initial simple answer, but then can be complexified, right? Oh, what about this? These people had bigger guns, they lost. Why'd they lose? You get it by having the high ground. I don't know. I don't teach history, but this is kind of the idea here, right? I ask them to notice, compare, create, struggle. Number 5, I ask them to predict. Okay, what if questions are some of the best ones. What am I going to do if this happens? Okay? And this requires them to gather some sort of evidence and reason their way forward. This is especially good in literature. Making predictions is one of the things we do a lot of times in literature. But you have to kind of imagine. It evokes their imagination in some sense. What if there were an A term in front of this quadratic? What if we heat this up? What if frog were in toad's shoes and toad were in frog's shoes? There's no magic beans for opening questions. You're going to struggle with them, okay? They're not always going to work, okay? But I think they're absolutely essential to try to do as a teacher. And if you're looking to take your teaching to the next level, okay? You're looking to do something that's going to inspire some wonder in your students. I think the only way that I've found that really works at the beginning of class is to try to do something like this, to pose something for them to deal with, for them, you're eliciting student responses. Okay. Let me move to the second topic for today, follow-up questions. Right. Here's a little bit from the Theaetetus again. Once more then, Theaetetus, I repeat my old question. What is knowledge? This is Socrates' opening question, yes? What is knowledge? Do not say that you cannot tell, but quit yourself like a man, and by the help of God you will be able to tell. At any rate, Socrates, after such an exhortation, I should be ashamed of not trying to do my best. Your students don't talk like this? Now he who perceives what he knows, and so far as I can see as present, knowledge is perception. That's a student response. Yes? Opening question, student response. Socrates follows up. Bravely said, boy. And that is the way in which you should express your opinion. And now let us examine together this conception of yours and see whether it is a true birth or a mere wind egg. Right? So Socrates is going to examine together. That's the idea. So, what's a follow-up question? Looks something like this. Follow-up question uses a student answer, experience, or response as the basis for another question. Instead of shifting to a new topic, follow-up questions prompt further discussion upon the same idea. Okay? So the follow-up question requires these first two things to happen, right? Question, student response. This is the follow-up question, but it requires you to do the eliciting. Right? Elicit and then respond. Okay? Notice this response is left pretty generic. There's a lot of different responses, and if we think about why are these things important? Number one, they help students to synthesize or make sense of their experiences. Okay? I'm leaving that word response down there pretty broad. And when we get into different situations, responses are not always verbal. Right? Silence is a response. A question is a response. A wrong answer is a response. Right? For sure. And so this doesn't always have to be, oh, I asked a question, a student had a great idea, and then I probed it further. Right? That's not going to happen all that often. A lot of times I'm going to have to ask a question and deal with whatever response happens. Deal with the slumping shoulders. Deal with the silence. If you're teaching 8th grade, deal with the hormones, right? I mean, all of those are responses that I can respond to as a teacher with another question. Okay, I'm moving on. Why are these things important? Number one, help students to synthesize or make sense of their experiences. Okay, I don't just want them to have experience. Experience is crucial for learning, but it is not learning. Okay, I have experiences, and then I make sense of them. I start to categorize them. I start to put them in bins. I start to try to think about why those experiences took place, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Number two, it allows us to dwell on meaningful ideas and problems. Okay? That there's a way in which, how often do we as teachers ask, we build up our class to this moment and we ask something and then it's over in 10 seconds. I want to dwell on this for a second. I want to dig a little bit deeper. Right? At the key bits, we want to be equipped with follow-up questions so we can take our classes deeper. Number three, probe into the reasons for truths and not just the truths themselves. I think this is one that as I've as I teach more and more, this is really important, where I've certainly had some students who especially I'm thinking about my 11th and 12th graders that I taught, and then I sent them off to college, and they came back to visit, and they stopped by the school, and I was just talking with them, and I realized they'd become kind of different people, and I wonder why did you lose some of these truths that you knew as an 11th and 12th grader? And I think they maybe just knew the truths. They just were able to tell me things, and they didn't really believe them. They didn't really know the reasons why they believed those things. And so follow-up questions allow us to ask them to explore the reasoning behind things. Why? Why do we believe that X? Why do we believe that Y? Okay. Number four, challenge students to provide explanations that go beyond one-word answers. One thing you can do with your teaching, and it's really painful, is film yourself and watch it. I would get a glass of wine, at least, right? When you watch yourself, because it's painful, maybe two. But count. One thing I like to do with my teaching is I count the kinds of things my students say. How often do my students give one-word answers? And if you notice, in that initial teaching of multiplication lesson, I did make you guys give answers, right? But they're one-word answers. They're one-word responses. How often did I force you to make an explanation where if I said, which is harder, fingers or pets, you're going to give me a one-word answer, right? Fingers, pets. Why do you think that? Now you got to give me an explanation. And it may not, right? I was teaching a kindergarten model lesson, and I'll never forget this moment. And we were doing calendar time, and it was like Tuesday the 12th, okay? And I asked them, what number are we going to put in on Friday? One girl raised her hand, and I said, yes. And she said, 15. And I said, that's great. How'd you figure that out? And the look on her face was like, she'd never been asked. She's like, I could have a thought, and then I could have another thought? Like, what's the hardest math bit to teach in the second or third grade textbook? What's the hardest lessons to teach in second and third grade math? You guys don't know. You're wrong if you think something, right? The hardest bit to teach is two-step problems. Why? Two-step problem example. John has $3. Steve has $4 more than John. How many do they have together? Why? Because students think 3, 4, together, add 7, next problem, done. All right? Because they're not conditioned to have two-step anything. They've never been asked a question and then ask another set of questions. What if we start, and two-step problems is always going to be difficult to teach, right? I would bar model that, and that would be why I would do that one. Another talk. But what we can do to help them is to ask them to do two-step things along the way, where I ask a question, you give me a one-word answer, and then I ask you to explain that answer. That's a thought, and then another thought. Stringing those kind of things together. That's the kind of skill we want to develop in students. And when you're like, my students don't think very deeply about something, that's because we haven't taught them to think deeply. Right? That deep thinking often requires us to make multiple steps at a time. Lastly, to rope in struggling students. This is one of the key ways we have, where I'll ask a very basic question, and then I'll be able to follow up. So I'll say something like this. Estimate 35 times 48. No hands, or a couple kids who have thoughts, but you've called on those guys already, right? Okay? There's some struggling that's going on. How do I, as a teacher, rope those students in? I say something like this. Well, is it bigger or less than 10? And then I don't ask for hands. Is it bigger or less than 10? It's bigger. How do you know? Follow-up question. Well, 35 is even bigger than 10. And to get a struggling student to be able to explain something, now you've roped them into the conversation. And guess what? They're doing the work of estimating out loud in front of you. That's what we wanted them to do in the first place. But I asked, they couldn't be here. Right? So what did I do? I asked them a question here, and then I asked them a question here, and I follow up, and I follow up, and I follow up, and I follow up. It's called scaffolding. This is what we do when students are struggling. We don't just stay here. We move here, and then we follow up. Okay, so situations and follow-up questions. Number 1, silence. And guess what's the same as silence? When I ask a question and I get one hand in the air, or two, that as a teacher is silence for me. Okay? And when I get silence, what's the easiest thing to do as a teacher? But the worst thing to do? Give them the answer, or call on the one kid with his hand up. That communicates to your students that that's okay. But what I need to do in that moment is to ask another question. That question that I asked didn't land for whatever reason. Let me ask something else. Right? I'm following up on silence with a question. Number 2, a wrong answer. Right? And again, what's the easiest thing to do with a wrong answer? Correct it. Or call on a different student for a right answer. Okay? But I want to take a wrong answer, and I want then to dig deeper that question. How'd you get that? What if it were this? I'm asking more questions to a wrong answer. Number 3, a correct answer. Again, each of these has a temptation to move on. Correct answer? Great. Next problem. Right? Rather than asking for explanation, asking for these types of things. Number 4, I think this is a tough one, a question. What do we like to do as teachers with questions? Answer them. I think there are ways in times answering makes sense. There's a lot of times where I can take that question and reframe it and ask it back. And I don't mean something trivial like, well, what do you guys think? Right? That's not a good follow-up question. Yes? Yeah, I think if you can see it, you might say, if you can see what they did wrong, you can say, did you do this? Right? And then they can say, oh yeah, that is what I did. And I say, why'd you do that? And what I want to do is affirm the thinking. I want to say, oh, that's a good thought. You were thinking about this correctly, but what did you miss? And again, right, I'm taking that answer, I'm affirming the thinking, I'm exposing the thinking. So if they can't see what they did, right, again, so what you have here, this is a really good example, right? You got a wrong answer, and then you asked a follow-up question. You said, what'd you do? And then what'd you get? You got this, right? I don't know what I did. So then you ask another question. You say, well, did you do this? And they say, I did. That's this, right? And then you respond by saying this, like, why did you do this? And so you're walking, the thing about follow-up questions, you don't know what your students are going to say, and so you got to be equipped to take whatever they give you and reframe it and run with it, right? Sometimes students aren't going to know what they did. Sometimes they're not going to know why they did it, right? And so being equipped to ask different questions, and sometimes you're going to have to tell them stuff, right? I'm not just going to sit up here and ask why all day, right? So sometimes you talk to them. But getting in the habit of asking these questions, like, that's the kind of teaching that you start to have dialogue with kids. You start to have, you're not always going to be asking questions continually, but we can respond with questions whenever, in lots of different ways. Okay, I know I'm running out of time here. Types of follow-up questions. These are important. Number one, these are the things I ask my students to do. I ask them to explain. Okay? Number three, I ask them to make a comparison. Let's do explanation in just a sec, right? 5 plus 8, 14. How'd you get that? That's pressing for explanation. Wrong answer, explanation. 5 plus 8, 14. Comparison question. 5 plus 9 is 14. What's 5 plus 8? Juxtaposition. I'm saying, oh, you think 5 plus 8 is 14? Let me compare that to something else that actually is 14. Now rethink your question. Rethink this. Oh, 5 plus 8 is 13. How'd you figure that out? Right. Correct answer. Response. Or where? Right. Number 3, a hook. Right. This is asking a basic question as a vehicle for getting somewhere else. Okay? This works really well. When you ask something and there's silence, you ask something that's simple. And then you work your way back up to that question. How do you win a war? Silence. What is a war? How do you win? Right? It's reverting back to something that's simpler. Hooking them in and then bringing them up forwards. That's a follow-up question. Number 4, a ramification question. You're probing the implications of a response. Right? What would that mean for X? If that's true, what about this one? Those types of things. And this maybe is we don't have I'm really short on time. I apologize for my time management here. But this is just a list of some questions that, are all these going to work all the time? No. Right? And are you going to have this, you're not going to have this chart sitting in front of you being like, okay, what I got is a wrong answer, and I want to ask a ramification question. This one. Right? You're not going to have this sitting in front of you, but what I'm saying is we have so many good follow-up questions available to us for any situation and any kind of thing. Right? Are all these great questions at all the times? No, but we got to get in the habit of teaching this way. Okay? And this is the type of things that one can do to really take this pedagogy of wonder and make it go forward. Let me take one example before we have to go forwards, right? Maybe this let's do question. Those are hard ones. And maybe I try a hook question, right? Someone asks me a question. I say, that's a really good question. I love that question. What would an answer to that question have to even start with? I've taken it, I've affirmed it, and I've turned it back on the student. I've hooked it, right? They asked a tough question. Instead of me answering it, I said, oh yeah, that's a really good question. Let's start at the beginning for that question. What would it have to look like? Is it going to work? Not sure. They might respond with silence, in which case, I got to figure out what to do then. This is kind of the fun part about teaching. It's not really that fun to show up and just put stuff on the board and have them copy it down in their notes and then have them practice it. That's not that fun. I don't know. I don't find it that fun. I don't think that's why you guys got into teaching. Just some best follow-up questions here. Especially when teaching math, these are some of my favorite ones. Right? What do you notice here? What could we try? Why is this difficult? I think is a really good one. For teaching math, what's tough about this? Right? How is this one different? How'd you figure it out? What was the key? I think it's another really good one. After a problem's over, what's the key to this stuff? Your strategy is good, especially when teaching little kids. I play War with my 4-year-old. War is a game of pure luck. And I ask him at the end, like, what was your strategy? He can tell me his strategy for a game of pure luck. He's like, I tried to get all the kings, Dad. It's like, okay, good stuff. Right? Where kids love talking about strategy, right? This is, do you think this always works is another good one. What if it were a little bit different? Some things that I think are not quite as good. I don't think there really are that many bad questions. Does anyone have any questions? I just don't think you get much traction with that. Kids can't answer that question, right? No one has any questions, right? I'd much prefer you to ask something like, what's the hardest part about this? That they can answer more, and then why is it hard? Right? For them to articulate, this is where I get confused. Or like, where do you get confused? It's almost like, ask me a question, rather than, do you have any questions? Here, let me put my email at the end, and then maybe shoot me an email. I'll send you the whole slide show. Okay. Sorry. Let me put my email at the end and just shoot me an email. I'll send you the whole thing. Does anyone have any questions about who can restate that question in their own words? I just don't think, it's not a bad question. You just don't get much traction with it. I don't find. Number 3, how's that make you feel? I don't really care. No. I just don't think it's as good, right? Number 4, what do you guys think about that? It's just too broad, too generic, right? And then the last one, just not asking questions. A few takeaways here, and then I'll be done, I promise. I know I'm over time. I know I didn't leave you guys any time for questions. My apologies. Number 1, a deeply rooted understanding of love and truth requires an explanation of the mystery that surrounds it. Number 2, questions, both opening and follow-up, are the single most thing that distinguishes wonder-based pedagogy. Number 3, remember your teaching priorities. Wisdom, thoughtfulness, conversation, etc. are all more important than getting through the material. Doesn't mean we don't have to get through the material, but if you're getting students to explain stuff, remember what I said last night about mathematics? One of the definitions of mathematics is the art of explanation. If you get kids explaining, they're doing math. You're already winning. Number 4, it's going to require some sort of perseverance. And number 5, this requires some habituation. You just got to get started. You just got to start asking them and see what happens. We finish with this last quote. The capacity to wonder is among man's greatest gifts. It signifies that the world is profounder, more all-embracing and mysterious than the logic of everyday reason had taught us to believe. When we teach like this, we are engaging with students' greatest gifts. Wonder is one of the things that we have access to as a teacher. It's not easy, right? But if we don't access their wonder, they're not going to care. Okay? And that's what we see more often.
That's Dr. Jonathan Gregg, Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, and his lecture, Asking Great Questions in Math, from the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminar on the art of teaching mathematics. To learn more about the Hoogland Center, visit the webpage at k12.hillsdale.edu. Click on the Events tab and look for Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.